ahead and get started. My name's Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute here at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. Before I introduce our guest, let me remind you of some of our upcoming events. We're actually sponsoring the talk of Ann Garrels tomorrow evening at the Bing in Spokane. That's at 7:30. Ann Garrels is the foreign correspondent for NPR. She'll be talking about her new book, Putin Country, A Journey into the Real Russia. So that should be quite interesting. If you're interested in some tickets, we have a couple of extra tickets that we could give to you if you're interested in going to that event. And then on our next event after that will be after Thanksgiving. It's on Tuesday, November 28th, here in the Foley Institute at noon. We have Amy Allen, who will be speaking on the topic of feminism in the era of Trump. She's from the Department of Philosophy at Penn State. And then on November 29th, we have a symposium. Well, it's actually not a symposium. It's a talk that's going to be given by Tom Newbig of the University of Michigan School of Business. He'll be talking about tax reform under the Republican plan. Why is it so hard, and who's going to gain from it? So those are our upcoming events. Let me now introduce today's speaker, who will be talking about immigration and immigration reform. Dan Tichenor is both a friend, and he's also the Phil Knight Chair of Political Science at the University of Oregon, so that's why he's got Nike gear on when you see him. But,
under the sock.
He's also a senior scholar at the Morse Center at the University of Oregon. He's published extensively on the American presidency, Congress, civil liberties, religion, immigration, and public policy. His books on immigration include Dividing Lines, The Politics of Immigration Control, which was published by Princeton University Press and which won the American Political Science Association's Best Book Award. And a second book, The Politics of International Migration, which was published by Oxford University Press. He's published numerous articles on immigration and on integration. They've appeared both in academic journals and in popular venues like The Atlantic, The Nation, and The New York Times. His most recent book, which is titled Rivalry and Reform, Presidents, Social Movements, and the Transformation of American Politics, will be published by the University of Chicago Press next year. He was also recently named to the inaugural class of Andrew Carnegie Fellows. Join me now in welcoming Dan Tichenor.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. And the last book that Cornell mentioned was something my publisher said I have to cut 15,000 words this week. So I've been home editing furiously. I think the horror writer Stephen King said you have to kill your little darlings and break your own little scribbler's heart. It's been breaking my heart. So thank you for giving me a reprieve from that. Let me start with an observation, and that is that DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, reflects long-term policy failure and a stirring yet vulnerable temporary movement victory. It also underscores profound challenges and contradictions ahead for immigration reform. So let me take up each of these points as briefly as I can, because I know you have 1 hour, so I want to make sure we have lots of time for Q&A. So let me start with this notion that it reflects long-term policy failure. So the first thing I'll ask is, when do you think unauthorized immigration first appeared on the national public agenda as a so-called collective problem? Any guess? You're going to pick a decade or a year? First time illegal immigration, undocumented immigration is viewed as a problem.
19th century.
19th century? So whereabouts in the 19th century do you think?
I would say in the east in the Midwest with the Germans
Okay.
and the Eastern Europeans coming in, the Italians.
Okay, interesting. So the answer is, there's like a research question that I tried to dig into, and so I looked at congressional hearings, newspapers across the country have this great historical databases now, and it's not in the 18th, so the period you're talking about when the Germans are coming, 1840s, and Italians, 50s, it doesn't appear then. So close, but no cigar. So any other guesses?
1492.
1492. Yeah, actually, if you spend time going through political cartoons, speaking of the 19th century, regular 19th century political cartoons capture indigenous peoples in Plymouth, looking at the at the landing of the Pilgrim saying, now might be a good time to enact immigration restrictions. So yeah, it's been with us for a long time. But no. So I'll cut to the chase.
1600s, the French and the English in Detroit.
I like that one. That's really good. But also no. So the answer, when it first starts appearing in newspapers and Congress takes it up in hearings and so forth, has to do with Chinese in the 1890s. Recall, we're in this region of the country where all Anglos were hot and bothered about Chinese immigrants. After the railroads are finished, and economic stresses and so forth, lots of racism. You have Chinese exclusion, 1882, again enacted 1892, and so forth. And what's happening, you first see it in newspapers like the LA Times, which talk about along the southern border with California, southern border with Mexico, they're saying there's a problem. Because among Mexican workers who are coming across the border, by the way, without documents, there are Chinese wearing sombreros trying to steal their way in. So to capture kind of the perceptions of a problem here, right? What's fascinating is you have huge numbers of Mexicans, even in these stories and covering this, coming across that border without inspection, who are not perceived as part of a problem. You were close with the Germans. I said you were close but no cigar. Where the Germans come up is the next time you see it really begin to come up in kind of public attention on the agenda is during World War I. It's lots of fears about German spies. And there the worry is not the porous border with Mexico, but with Canada. And lots of stories, most of them conspiracy theories, but yet it caught a lot of public attention about Germans stealing across the Canadian border during World War I. It's not until you really get into the 1920s where you start to have lots of discussions about this in terms of a Mexican issue. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because the other thing that really stands out is that even during some of our most restrictionist moments in terms of legal admissions, we have always had this insatiable appetite for cheap, exploitable labor, particularly immigrant labor. We're a nation built upon immigration, and that means we were built upon this very tractable labor force. And so let me give you kind of 3 historical examples about why we continue to have this yearning for Mexican workers, even during some of our most nativist and restrictionist moments. So the first example is in the 1917 legislation, which was a literacy test law. We, at the time, passed this law under the notion that, at the time, eugenics were all the rage, kind of the pseudoscientific notion of the supremacy of white Anglo-Saxons. The preference was for Northern and Western Europeans. They viewed Southern and Eastern Europeans, my people, as being swarthier, more not just ethnically inferior, but racially inferior. And so the idea was, we'll pass a literacy test because those from Southern and Eastern Europe innately will be less capable of passing that test because we're just dumber, was the notion, okay? All right, so they passed that law. Along with that also were head taxes, because they wanted to make sure that they were getting people who they felt would be economically self-sufficient. So they wanted to kind of have some monetary barrier involved too. By the way, before I say anything about the Mexicans on this, it turned out, actually no, I'll hold off on it. I'll tell you about that in a second. So punchline is, World War I, we have the literacy test in place, and there's a significant number of Mexican workers who are being used by ranchers, agricultural businesses and so forth throughout the Southwest, who are very upset because Mexican workers are no longer flowing across the border. One was the literacy barrier, the second was that head tax. Those groups, those employers, lobbied the Labor Department and the Wilson administration. They said, we'll waive it for Mexicans. So the literacy tests and head taxes were in place for European immigrants. We also had all kinds of barriers to Chinese immigration and other forms of Asian immigration in 1917, but we wanted to make sure the border was open so we can feed our appetite for this Mexican labor. Fast forward. So here was the thing I was going to mention a moment ago. Get to the 1920s, the literacy test actually did nothing to dampen Southern and Eastern European immigration. Their calculation that Southern and Eastern Europeans would fail because they didn't have the intelligence to pass the literacy test was wrong. And so the numbers show that they were passing at much higher rates than the Northern and Western Europeans. So, since there's a number of scholars in the room, students, graduate students, faculty and so forth, you would think maybe the empirical evidence might lead you to the conclusion that that hypothesis was wrong, so they come up with a different hypothesis. But no, that wasn't the solution. What happened is that the scientific experts, along with members of Congress, said the reason Southern and Eastern Europeans are passing it is because countries like Italy and Russia and so forth are giving them cheat sheets so they can pass the literacy test that way. And because of that problem, they said we're going to keep the literacy test and head taxes in place, but we'll add to the equation by imposing national origins quotas, which very explicitly reserved all legal immigration slots, about 84% for Northern and Western Europeans. Most of the rest were then for the Southern Eastern Europeans. And they also significantly lowered the number of immigrants who were coming each year. Up to that point, you really averaged at what was then record levels of about 1 million immigrants per year. Some years it was much higher than that. And then what happened after the 1924 and 1928 Quota Acts is it imposed a ceiling of around 140,000 per year. So you have these very draconian quotas that are ethnically focused on this notion of white Anglo-Saxon superiority, and you have this significant ceiling. Okay? What's interesting is that all of this was really targeted to closing the front door to overseas immigration. So you have these significant stringent limits on European inflows, and we enacted the same something called the Asiatic Barred Zone, which in effect was going to keep out all non-European immigration that wasn't in the Western Hemisphere. So that last thing is crucial, Western Hemisphere. During this period, 1924, 1928, there were various immigration restriction groups like the Immigration Restriction League and other nativist organizations who said, we've got another problem. If their obsession was white supremacy and racial hierarchy, they looked at groups like Mexicans as being a threat to our national identity, to basically the demographics of the country. So they are proposing, let's make sure we put in these kind of stringent limits on that too. What was interesting in this is that the coalition that was passing these restrictive laws was comprised of these northern and midwestern nativist groups, but also southern and western nativists as well. What was curious about that is those groups, particularly the southerners and westerners, said we want access to Mexican labor, so don't touch that. So I've spared you a PowerPoint, but if I were going to do PowerPoint slides, I would give you lots of quotes from historical materials that I've found that capture this notion that's emphasized among the coalition, just letters among people who are part of this restrictive coalition saying, if we want to get through quota legislation, we have to throw in a bribe to the southern and western members of our coalition to keep Mexican immigration open. And indeed, one of the things that ends up being said explicitly in public is you have various folks like one Texas senator who said, don't worry, if you're worried about Mexicans ruining the racial complexion of our country, they are a returnable labor force. So the argument that they made was that unlike the Chinese, who once here were very hard to get back home, and likewise with Southern Eastern Europeans and Jews in particular, who they also viewed as inferior, Mexicans, they said, because we have a contiguous border, when we don't want their labor, we can force them out. So it's explicitly this notion of maintaining an open door in terms of the border, overland immigration. And what's striking is during this period you saw both significant flows of temporary legal immigrants. You also had legal immigrants, temporary workers, and also undocumented. And that kind of starts quite early. Let me quickly give you another, a third example of this sort of tradition of kind of bringing in Mexican workers, both authorized and unauthorized, throughout these periods. That's basically in the 1940s and 1950s. We had something called the Bracero program that many of you know about. There's wonderful oral histories that are now available interviewing those who were Braceros that I can point you to if any of you students are interested in this. It's really fascinating stuff. About 4.2 million Braceros, or temporary Mexican workers, came into the United States as contracted labor from World War II until it was terminated in 1963. What's striking is it first started as a war power emergency measure to deal with the fact that so many men were fighting overseas, so we needed to kind of get in these new workers. And it turned out that when the war was over and the original impetus was removed, that a lot of the employer groups, again, Southwestern growers and others, said, no, we love this labor, let's keep it in place. It's not political science class, I won't tell you about iron triangles, but there was, for those of you who know what that is, there was an iron triangle that formed around keeping the braceros in place. Not surprisingly, at the very same time as you had the millions of temporary, contracted, legal Mexican workers, you also had steady streams of undocumented Mexican workers flowing into the country as well. And by the way, sometimes you had braceros who quickly became undocumented because when they originally were contracted, they were supposed to stay with a certain employer, and it might be the farm or the ranch next door said, we'll give you better wages. And the minute they stepped over that property line to get the better deal over there, they became unauthorized. To give you a sense about how this was understood very well by members of Congress and other authorities in Washington, you had constant oversight on these things, and members of Congress, usually agricultural committees and judiciary committees, dominated by people like James Eastland, whose name might sound familiar to those who are older in the room. Somebody who was adamantly opposed to civil rights reform, filibustered on that, but had his own farm where he hired both documented and undocumented Mexicans to do his labor. And he was supposed to be the person to do oversight on these questions. Okay, well let me jump ahead. The punchline here about these examples is that we had a big wink as a nation, from our government and practices in terms of our political economy when it came to Mexican labor throughout these periods. Occasionally, going back to that phrase the Texas senator said about a returnable labor force, occasionally you would see these very splashy moments in which the government would engage in fact, mass deportation campaigns. First one was during the Great Depression, but when we needed more labor, the workers were back. Another was something, and you get a sense of kind of the period and also kind of the racism involved with this was under Dwight Eisenhower, something called Operation Wetback, which was launched in 1954, led by the Immigration Naturalization Service, but with cooperation of National Guard, state police, local police, and so forth, did massive roundups throughout the Southwest. Similar kind of deal, massive roundups, many of whom were basically were going by, talking about profiling on a mass scale, were focusing on people's color. They were assuming, so they didn't necessarily pay attention to whether somebody was a citizen, legal permanent resident, or an undocumented immigrant. They did massive roundups and brought people across the border. But soon thereafter, those numbers were again restored. And in our laws at the time was something that was explicitly called the Texas Proviso, passed by a coalition of Southern and Western members of Congress that basically said, if you engage in smuggling undocumented immigrants over the border, you are breaking the law. But if you're one of these employers, farmers, ranchers, whoever who hires them, you're held innocent, and you're not breaking the law. That was known as the Texas Proviso. Okay. Well, by the 70s and 80s, you had broad agreement among most Americans and most policymakers in Washington that the system was broken. There was a need, that immigration policy was in need of significant reform, especially with regard to what to do about porous borders and the presence of around 3 million undocumented immigrants in the country. But things were constantly stuck in Washington. Polarizing conflict, the need for strange bedfellow coalitions, lots of false starts. Sound familiar? And so ultimately, and I'll spare you the fits and starts about how we finally got the legislation, but ultimately in 1986 we passed something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And this legislation ultimately was a result of a bipartisan coalition that engaged in what was called the Grand Bargain, but you might describe it as a Faustian bargain that had 4 main pieces. And when I describe the pieces, it's going to capture for you kind of a recurring pattern in our immigration reforms, which is lots of contradictions rather than coherence in the kinds of legislation we pass, precisely because it's always required compromises that involve left-right or bipartisan coalitions that cut across the ideological spectrum. So the first thing that Immigration Reform and Control Act of '86, IRCA, had was, well, one of the problems that was raised during this period was from economic protectionists, who said the problem was that there was a magnet of jobs for undocumented immigrants. The solution, they believed, was to go after employers who knowingly hired these workers. So the solution was, they said, employer sanctions, civil and criminal penalties against these employers. So that passes as part of this bargain, but it ended up being a toothless tiger, because to actually make it work, you had to have tamper-proof IDs when you go to the job place, which we didn't have. There were, in fact, within weeks of this passing, there were counterfeit IDs that people could buy for about $50 in LA and elsewhere to get the job. A second component of the law stemmed from a different group that was part of this voting coalition, which were border hawks. They said the problem was, in fact, that we had porous borders, so we had to do something to control that. And what they got as part of the law was enhanced border patrol resources, and what you saw was really kind of a path to militarizing, particularly our southern border. Civil rights and ethnic groups said the problem was allowing so many people to live in the shadows of American life, that we created a permanent caste system. So the solution, which was enacted, was a legalization program that basically led to roughly 3 million undocumented immigrants getting green cards and eventually having a path to citizenship if they so chose to follow that to its fruition. And finally, agribusinesses said the problem was that they needed access to cheap workers, especially in harvesting and so forth. So we had a temporary farm worker program that was enacted. So those 4 components: employer sanctions, enhanced border control and enforcement measures and resources. Third, legalization. And fourth, some kind of temporary worker program. Whenever we talk about this issue, even to this day, that's what comes up, is often those kind of recur as the way to deal with these things. Well, within a few years after IRCA's passed, unauthorized flows grew. And enhanced border controls also had unintended consequences, namely that prior to this militarizing of the border, you had something called the revolving door, where you had undocumented workers who might come, work, be here for a certain season, and return back to almost what kind of sister communities in Mexico. But once we enhanced the border control and you basically raised the bar and the cost of leaving, making it hard to get back in, it had the effect, unintended consequence, of freezing that population here, so that the disincentives to return were quite high, and so most decided to stay. On the other hand, at the time, the economic incentives to try to basically undertake whatever risk necessary to get in still remained strong. So what you saw then was a steady increase in the undocumented population in the United States. So in the decades since, we've had fierce debate and no action on comprehensive immigration reform, grassroots mobilization both for and against immigration and immigrant rights. And in the halls of power, both parties are also dramatically polarized on the issue. There have been a few serious bipartisan pushes. You can think about 2006 or 2012, but they ultimately were derailed. So, hence my first point, that since the early 20th century to present, what we have is a story of long-term policy failure and contradictions. Now to the second point I mentioned, which is that DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was a stirring but also vulnerable or temporary movement victory. And here the story of the Obama presidency and immigration is an interesting one. It's a checkered story. When Obama was running for office and early in his presidency said that he was completely in favor of comprehensive immigration reform, that he strongly favored providing legalization to bring those roughly 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants out of the shadows and have access to full membership. He also constantly emphasized the strengths of immigration in general for the country, and he hired as one of his chief domestic policy advisors someone named Cecilia Munoz, who had been at the head of the National Council of La Raza, highly respected among immigrant rights communities for the work she had done in the past as a champion for immigration, for immigrant opportunities, and particularly also Latino representation. But then here's where the story gets a little more checkered, if not dramatically more so. He did not make comprehensive immigration reform a top priority when he had Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. And also, and quite controversially, he started to engage in strict enforcement efforts or deportations that were at that point record levels of 400,000 a year. And his argument for this was that he said, I want to show that I can be tough in my enforcement so it gives me credibility when we go to the bargaining table to get legalization for undocumented immigrants, to show we can control enforcement issues. And there's another part of this, which he didn't say, but I think we can also interpret in this, is how many of you have been watching the series on Vietnam on PBS? You know, there's a Democratic component of this, of a Democratic president not wanting to, with LBJ, not wanting to look soft on communism. So Democrats worried about that, wanting to look tough, or Bill Clinton on crime. And I think there's another example of that, of a Democrat not wanting to basically get outflanked by his conservative critics by saying, look, I was weak on this issue, too soft, and so forth. Well, against this backdrop, what's interesting is that older immigrant rights groups, like the National Council of the Laws that I mentioned, the National Immigration Forum, and a host of others, basically were quite patient with Obama. They met regularly with Munoz and others who assured them that he wanted to get immigration reform done, and the problem was, quite genuinely, that they got no help on the Republican side. That past comprehensive reforms required these strange bedfellows left and right, and that it was so hard to get that kind of cooperation. And so among these older guard immigrant rights groups, what was usually the norm is that they viewed Obama as an ally and appreciated the challenges he faced in Congress on this question. What's fascinating, here's where we get to kind of the stirrings of movement activity that go in important directions, and how you can have reform that's not just top-down, but also involves grassroots bottom-up processes, is that the Dreamer movement was anything but forgiving on this question. They didn't agree with the older immigrant rights groups that they should be patient with Obama. And here, by the way, I think there's a striking parallel to the civil rights movement of several decades before, where you had older guard civil rights groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Urban League, NAACP, counseling younger activists of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to calm down, go slow, be patient. We got the Civil Rights Act, we'll get voting rights later. And the younger insurgents were, in fact, not willing to hear them. And really the Freedom Summer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party Challenge and so forth really is an example of that. And I think there's a parallel here. During meetings between Obama and immigrant rights activists behind closed doors, what's striking is how contentious they were. Again, the older guard immigrant rights groups were counseling patience and sympathy and viewed Obama as their ally, whereas the Dreamers who were invited to these gatherings were quite hostile to the president and basically pressed him. And he would get quite frustrated. I'll spare you the long quotes, but I have stuff from interviews about how he would slam the table in frustration and saying, I was part of the movement, I was a community organizer, you don't understand, I'm on your side. And the Dreamers in the room saying, first of all, you were only a community organizer for a year and a half. And also, you now are sitting in a different seat. And what's interesting, one of the United We Dream's key leaders, Lorella Pirelli, said to him, I heard in a speech once you were talking about how important it was that Phillip Randolph constantly held FDR's feet to the fire with this threat of a march on Washington. And that it was key when LBJ was president that the movement would go out and make him do it. Our job is to make you do it, not to be your friend. And in fact, they followed that general approach in a variety of protests. He became known as the Deporter-in-Chief in a lot of their efforts in this regard. And I don't have time because I'm looking at my time and I need to shorten things up so we can have Q&A. But I want to emphasize, one of the things that's interesting is when we actually get DACA, it's in June 15th, 2012. It's the anniversary of Plyler v. Doe, which we can talk about why that's important if you don't know that case later. But what's striking is that Obama had to basically be dragged kicking and screaming to sign off on that. Because he was again trying to kind of calculate, how do I take a position as a president who's going to basically be the most unifying for not just the left but the center as my coalition. At that point, Dreamers dramatically increased the protests they were engaging in, but also had the press leak that they were negotiating with Marco Rubio, the Florida Republican senator, on Dreamer Act legislation. Worried about getting outflanked, the Obama administration quickly began to call the Dreamers into the room and say, let's talk about DACA. So a longer story, but that's why I think it's an example of kind of a stirring movement victory, but also one that they understood at the time was quite vulnerable. It was fleeting because it's basically a Band-Aid hanging on prosecutorial discretion. It's not a permanent fix. So again, we can talk more about that if you want. So let me kind of briefly talk about three conflicts that continue to make this issue so difficult for us right now, and why comprehensive immigration reform, to paraphrase Beckett, is like waiting for Godot. We've been stuck in neutral for so long. And the short version of this is that we all know the partisan divide on this. And all you need to do is watch the last election and see what positions President Trump and Secretary Clinton took on this issue, or look at the party platforms to see just how polarized we are on this thing. But what's also the case is that we have, for generations, and still today, have profound divisions within the parties. We often like to think about things in bifurcated ways between liberals and Democrats, red state, blue state, and so forth. But in this is an issue that cuts across both parties. So let me give you three conflicts that kind of capture this. The first is an economic conflict. So on one hand, so within Democratic ranks, the division over economic issues is between those who take a position that we ought to have economic opportunity that's universal, so let's welcome these workers and so forth, and others who traditionally associate with the labor movement and also African American civil rights, who said, look, what about social justice for those who are already here? There's a quote that I like to give from Frederick Douglass, who in the 1870s looks at the country and says, every hour sees a newly arrived Irish immigrant take a job from a freed slave. And what he's commenting on there is his sense that he wasn't anti-immigrant, but he was concerned about these new Irish immigrants basically getting economic opportunities before African Americans had that chance. You can fast forward, and this is where Barbara Jordan also weighed in the 1990s on this stuff. What about for the Republicans? Well, it may seem, after the last election, you may think, well, I don't think there are any pro-immigration Republicans, but it's actually not true at all. They may be quietly hiding, but in fact, there's a long tradition of on the economic side, the notion of matching willing workers with willing employers. So there's a long-standing kind of service industry, chambers of commerce approach about wanting to provide employers with access to these workers. On the flip side is what you heard in the last election, which kind of a conservative populism with Pat Buchanan that Trump took up about they're taking our jobs. Long-standing demographic, racial divide on this, and I could say a lot about this, but I'm going to kind of jump ahead because I think you guys know it and we could talk about it later. And the last real conflict that divides both parties, both internally and between each other, is about security. Kind of xenophobia surrounding national security has been with us for a long time, and this notion that on one side, letting newcomers in is viewed as making us less safe is something that you've had among isolationists in both parties. So, for instance, in World War II, there was an argument about not letting in Jewish refugees because the idea was they were viewed as politically radical and potentially dangerous to our national security. During the Cold War, you had McCarthyite folks who said, don't let in those communists from behind the Iron Curtain because they're going to bring in their radical ideologies, they're going to be allies of socialist perspectives, again, they'll endanger us. And we've heard a more recent version of this around the so-called Muslim ban, right? To keep out those refugees will be safer. There's a longer tradition among internationalists. Some of the first were Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson. Hamilton and Jefferson didn't agree on much, but they agreed that the country had a special obligation to refugees. Fast forward, Harry Truman during World War II talked about displaced persons as akin to the Marshall Plan, that it makes us and the world safer to be generous. Eisenhower said it's insane not to encourage refugees from behind the Iron Curtain because these are the people who are escaping precisely its ruthlessness. So an argument about kind of being in our national interest. So let me say, in conclusion, John Kenneth Galbraith, said you always have to say in conclusion to give your audience some hope. So we desperately need comprehensive immigration reform. But we've been stuck in neutral for 30 years. And at the heart of that is what I was mentioning a moment ago about both inter-party divides and intra-party ones. And the other component of this is that you have, I describe them as the huddled elites. At the national level, our policymakers are frozen. And likewise, we have lots of restiveness from mass publics on both sides of this issue. In the absence of comprehensive reform, we have an unsettling amount of unilateral power that's left in the hands of the White House and executive branch officials. It also allows a corrosive form of American apartheid to persist. One of my favorite political philosophers, Michael Walzer, said, liberal democracies cannot flourish when we have permanent gradations of membership. And so long as we are stuck in this mode, that's precisely what we face in terms of 11 to 12 million undocumented immigrants lacking any access to full membership. And so with that, thank you for your patience.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Let me start. I was struck you didn't mention Donald Trump or the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So
You didn't have to.
So how do you see his role? Is it going to be an official role, or is there a trajectory that he's put us on, or what?
Mm-hmm. So much to say. I mean, I could hold forth for another 40 minutes, and you all have to get to class and so forth. So you have to bring more pizzas if I was just going to talk about, because I have done this where it's only going to talk about the impact of Donald Trump's candidacy and then his administration on these issues. He's implicit in here. I mean, one of my goals here was to kind of capture for you, one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain is that history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes, is to give you some sense about the larger context for where we are now. And Trump is not some, it may be a version of what we've seen in the past on steroids, but it's not new. And so to be more specific about that, you don't want to go into recent history. The kind of campaign, we have never had a successful presidential candidate who engaged in such a dramatic form of anti-immigrant appeal, or appeals to those who are particularly, so it wasn't just on immigration, it wasn't just build the wall. To me, the real moment, well, you could say the very first day of his campaign where he talked about all Mexicans are rapists and murderers, but to me the real key moment, which I suspect you can appreciate based on your expertise, is when he attacked Judge Curiel.
Oh, yes.
An American-born judge who he said is going to have biases because he's Mexican. So it's really, the campaign itself is stunning to the degree that we had a successful candidate for the presidency who's so openly engaged in that kind of demagogic appeal to our kind of strongest prejudices when it comes to people from overseas. That said, we've had Chinese exclusion and other things that have kind of been part of our elections, but in modern times, he stands out among modern presidents in that regard. Impact. Well, one thing is, it's striking, I mentioned movement politics. Long before Trump got into office, you had movement politics on both sides of this. Both those who get ginned up by the build the wall approach and those who want to resist this assault on potentially certain rights. In terms of actual policy, it goes back to, I think the Trump administration wants to declare itself as, I think the phrase they used before was that they're the most successful modern presidency in history. And then the question is, well, what are the accomplishments? And it's interesting. Look, so we want actual legislation. I can say there's been no impact because there's been proposals that we're going to change the legal immigration system to basically scale back family reunification visas and emphasize skill or merit, which is, there's a dog whistle in that, which we don't have time to talk about, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere. You have the potential, I mentioned about how you for both Obama and for President Trump, when in the absence of comprehensive reform, it increases the role in terms of unilateral executive power. And that's where we can see an impact for the Trump administration. Now, some things, like his immigration ban on, was it 5 or 7, predominantly 7 countries that were majority Muslim, it's been stuck in court. but you can see it on the enforcement side. But even there, have we seen a significant change? There have been threats that they're going to up the ante beyond the 400,000 per year that Obama was pursuing. And so we have like flashes that it could be far more significant than that. And yet, to date, the numbers are not significantly, you could have a debate about who's the deporter in chief. So I think that's been, but here's goes back to the reason I mentioned successes, where it's interesting how we might be rethinking how we define what a president's impact is what is the rhetorical and cultural impact? And there I think Trump's impact with regard to how we argue, we've been arguing about immigration since our founding, but the level of vitriol and the significance of the toxicity of it has, I think, reached levels we have not seen, especially emanating and fueled from the Oval Office. And that, I think, it's been really a profound impact. So, I mean, we're all still trying to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
So, excellent job of laying out the complexity. I would add one more to your three, and that is the modern environmental movement, of course, is very complex.
Yeah.
But that movement is itself divided on this issue. Could you say a few words about that?
Absolutely.
ZPG folks.
Yeah, it's a wonderful point. And Sierra Club. So,
Exactly.
So in the 1970s, you had one form of new immigration restrictionism really emanated from the environmental movement. And in fact, there's an organization called the Federation for American Immigration Reform, those who follow immigration policy will know that organization is consistently taking restrictionist positions. The founder of FAIR was in fact somebody who cut his teeth as an environmental activist. And the first things he said is, look, I am getting animated on this issue not because of questions of demography or race. I'm animated on these issues because of the environment. And so you had groups like Zero Population Growth and Sierra Club and so forth advocating real kind of stringent limits on legal immigration as well as cracking down on undocumented immigration. What's interesting, but by the way, the movement itself is very divided, so that in the 70s, you might get someone who knocked on your door from Sierra Club who talked about immigration restriction along with other initiatives. That's no longer the case. So more, in recent decades, the environmental movement's top leadership for groups like Sierra Club has tried to move away from this, but they were at the heart of kind of these stirrings of a restrictionist movement earlier on. But I'll throw out this, which is when I've interviewed some of the folks who were with Zero Population Growth and Sierra Club who were more restrictionist on this issue at the time, and I said, because I had a hard time logically understanding their argument, because how is the U.S. environment protected by creating kind of a fortress U.S. unless you're going after population issues worldwide? So I couldn't quite figure that out. And the analogy I drew was like acid rain. Acid rain doesn't acknowledge borders. And so how does that work? And so there were certain arguments that were about, well, if we can control population here, that might be a model for elsewhere. And so that's one approach. At its kind of ugliest excesses, I've had certain environmentalists tell me, well, it's because Mexicans and people below, south of the border, have less ecological fealty. They're dirtier and blah, blah, blah. So they start to hedge into kind of those progressive eugenicist arguments without, I think, they're being aware of that.
It's also just pure NIMBY.
Yes.
The people who advocated in the early days the national parks didn't want a lot of people around them either.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so it's part of it. Just
So it's space.
Plain old NIMBY, yeah.
And we get that in the Pacific Northwest because we have,
Exactly.
we don't want those people in California to know that we exist, right? So,
That's a cultural issue.
yes, please.
Would you be willing to elaborate on Asian barcode? Asianic
Oh,
barcode?
the Asiatic barred zone.
Oh, bars.
Barred zone. Yeah. So sure. So basically, what you had in the late 19th century was, speaking of the parties, was the Democratic and Republican Party competing for the votes of Western Americans who were basically xenophobic, who had lots of hatreds for Chinese. And the reason that they were competing for them is you had at the point post-Civil War the solid South, which was always voting Democratic, and the North, which was going Republican. And the West was a key swing region in terms of who would actually win the presidency and often Congress, and very close title elections year after year. And so when you had Chinese exclusion leagues that were formed in the late 19th century, you basically had each party, the New York Times said, which party is going to stagger over the other for the Western vote? And the answer is both. And so that's why you had 1882, Chinese exclusion law. We had another one in 1888. We had another one in 1892. You might wonder why. And the reason is they were always presidential election years, and since it was good for getting votes in one year, we'll simply pass a law that's even tougher the next. That endured into the 20th century. And one of the key things, it goes back to strange bedfellows, you had kind of these elite Republican Brahmin from New England, like Henry Cabot Lodge, who was signing off on Asian exclusion and new forms of European restriction. But a key component to their coalition, because they wanted to get folks from the left, was organized labor. So they got the old American Federation of Labor to sign on, and the thing that the American Federation of Labor was particularly committed to was sweeping Asian exclusion. It's something that united, except for the Knights of Labor was interesting on this, but other labor organizations were united on this. And so one of the components when they passed comprehensive immigration reform in 1917 and 1924 was to create this notion of barring all immigration outside of Europe and in the Western Hemisphere. Does that help? Okay. Yeah.
If you had the ability to advise an enlightened immigration policy, what would you advocate?
Great question. And I always swing and miss on this one because so I'll do my best, but like most scholars, we're really good at critiquing and pointing out the warts, but then we have to actually create something. But so there's no way around the fact that whatever I could give you thoughts of what an ideal policy would look like. I have kind of thoughts that are pretty radical about carrier capacity and. There's often a notion that, hey, if you open the borders, whatever, industrial democracy will be swamped. And actually the data suggests that's not the case. But the reality, the pragmatic reality is to get, for this next round of comprehensive immigration reform, whenever it's going to come, is going to require a bargain. And the question is, how do we learn from kind of the past? So I mentioned those four things. That whenever we address undocumented immigration questions, we always, at least recently, it always has some component of employer sanctions, legalization, enhancing, border control, and some kind of temporary worker stuff. So I would tell you things I would love to remove from that. The temporary worker programs, especially the farm worker programs, have often been exploited. That's been the tradition, and it's problematic. If there was a clear path to green cards and full membership, some movement out of those areas, that to me would be important. Legalization, to me, is in '86 was the best version in terms of if you've arrived at a certain date, all should be eligible so long as you can pass some basic tests of for national security that someone's not posing, and that's such an infinitesimally small number. So what we've seen since '86 is folks who want to attach a lot of conditions, so that you can come in, but and you can stay, but we'll basically have one set of rights for people who came here as adults and a different set of rights for the kids and so forth. And I think it's much better to have a straightforward system that allows for adjustment of status more broadly. But I worry about, as I mentioned, that permanent gradations issue about you don't want to create these sort of caste systems within that population. And the other implication, by the way, it is kind of the we didn't have time to talk about it, but the two-edged sword behind DACA and Dreamer legislation is that you can get Orrin Hatch and Javier Becerra and a whole bunch of people to agree on Dreamer legislation because the emphasis is on what's viewed as sort of like the most sympathetic, the most so-called innocent undocumented immigrants. And if it helps 800,000 to 1 million young people, you might say, great, then embrace that. But the question I have is, does that cut the other way? Because we have a long tradition in our country's history about distinguishing between so-called good and bad immigrants. So if the implication is if this group is innocent and deserving, are we saying the other group is criminal and undeserving? And where it gets in terms of the realities of where, social reality meets public policy is the vast majority of families that have an undocumented young person in them is something that is called mixed legal status, where only about 20% are families in which everyone is undocumented. So it means that most families, 80% of that 11 to 12 million, are in families in which mom might have a green card, dad might be undocumented, sister number one is undocumented, but younger brother was born here, so it gets very complex. So legalization to me is good. So here's where I think part of the compromise. Employer sanctions has never worked because we've never had a system for identification and so forth. And I think, that's going to be the tough test for folks who want, if there's an argument about the balance has to be between enforcement and then legalization. The enforcement side, I think employer sanctions is probably the area where we've invested the least, but it's probably the most promising if you want to kind of go after unscrupulous employers who knowingly hire folks. In terms of the border stuff, I don't know how many of you have been down to San Diego. The INS, now the ICE, you're allowed to take tours. They'll give you on tours, and you can see it is really impressive what's there. I'm not sure the build the wall thing. It's a great rhetorical line, I guess, for folks who are really upset about porous borders. But in terms of actually being efficacious with dollars, it's not going to do anything. So, anyways, does that help a little bit? Now, my tortured path is because this is an area where it's really hard to divine exactly. Now, when we talk about legal immigration, all of us immigration scholars brighten up because that's an easier thing for us to talk about because it's easier to talk about how you expand opportunities. And in that area, I think what's striking is policymakers trying to describe a zero-sum battle between reuniting families versus bringing in those who have needed job skills, expertise, and so forth. I don't think it's an either-or. And in 1990, when we did this, we simply grew the pie a little bit so that we expanded the economic categories while still maintaining pathways for families to stay together.
Is the egg industry still hiring?
The egg
lots of
industry?
workers every spring and summer throughout the United States?
Yes.
And some are illegals.
Yes.
It goes with that. I think that a lot of this is exploitative when you look at the migrant farm workers and the living conditions and the health conditions and all that they have to go through. And I also look at the money that's generated in the agricultural business by the farm owners and how much of this type of policy is influenced by that to protect that exploitation. Because if they were employing legal status, they would have more rights and they couldn't be exploited as easily. So what do you see as the connection between the exploitation and the policies?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, and I gave examples of kind of giving a longer story about the experience of Mexican workers as this cheap exploitable labor force, but it's been with us for a long time. One of my favorite quotes is from an Italian immigrant from the 1880s who said, "I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. But I learned three things when I got here. The first was that the streets are not paved with gold. The second is that the streets aren't paved. And the third is these people expect me to pave them." So it goes back to, so this notion about when I said we're a nation built upon immigration, it's kind of the parallel story that Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about in terms of the use of black bodies in building up this nation in terms of its economy and so forth. A very similar story with immigrants. And so exploitation is at the heart of that. What's striking is that if you look at every period of major immigration reform, sometimes like in 65 and 1990, we expanded immigration opportunities to a more diverse set of legal immigrants. but we also maintain this stream of exploitable workers, both authorized, unauthorized, temporary, permanent. At moments, this is what to me is kind of the kicker, to your point, is at moments when we've actually tried to restrict immigration in the name of security or demography and so forth, we have also kept open sometimes the front door, other times the back door, to again this flow of exploitable labor. So at the heart of this is that, to me, you can see lots of variation depending on what line you want to trace in terms of our policies, but one thing that's almost been pretty straight has been the demand and satisfaction for tractable immigrant labor or foreign labor. And the exceptions stand out too, because I mentioned the repatriation of Great Depression or Operation Wetback in '54, but they were temporary blips until that labor demand went back up. So does that help? I mean, there's so much more we could talk about.
We have time for one more question, I think. Yes.
I guess I was wondering how electoral politics and the fact that the Hispanic population is one of the largest growing in the States, what impact that might have. And especially, I was just fascinated with the story about the Puerto Ricans who fled because of the hurricane, and who, once they come here, immediately are have voting rights. How things, what impact, and will that affect, make it easier to get immigration reform, or is it kind of a washout?
Well, so the short answer right now is because of the way we've done redistricting, is that that our gerrymandering has been constructed in such a way that it is slowing down the process by which new immigrant, particularly Latino and Asian voters, are having potentially the maximal impact on the system. Right. But it's coming. But right now, the way we draw those lines is kind of an effort to slow that down. I'll mention that one of the kind of key elements of all of this that people don't know is that in 1952, we passed something called the McCarran-Walter Act, which was, again, very restrictive, but it threw in something that was meant to be kind of rhetorically appealing to egalitarians, which was it changed naturalization law. 1790, our naturalization law said it's open to free white men. And what that meant is that for all the Irish and Germans and so forth who came in during the 19th century, those white male immigrants, European, quickly got access to the ballot box, and the party machines used them, and so their impact in terms of policy ended up being quite dramatic in lots of ways. So the reason why the Jeffersonians and the Jacksonians and others during those decades were very attentive to new Irish and German immigrants. But we mentioned the Chinese, when we were asking about the Asiatic Bar Zone, for instance, did not, if they were not born in this country, could never naturalize, based on how the laws were written. Okay? 52 was thrown in as this kind of thing of Cold War symbolism, that we'll basically change the naturalization law to let anyone who follows basic rules gain access to citizenship. And what's interesting about that is naturalization levels, especially among Latin American and Asian immigrants during the 70s and 80s, were quite low. But when faced with significant threats, first in the 90s, and then more recently, have been going up dramatically. So I think you were very, astute to point that out. It is going to be in some ways, is a significant force in American politics at the local and state level. Look at how California's changed. Mm-hmm. Arizona, which was the state of the show me your papers, racial profiling, Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Sheriff Joe Arpaio got voted out in Maricopa County, largely by significant amounts of Latino voters. So even Arizona is seeing this real shift. So it's coming. But in terms of the national impact, in terms of Congress, it's been delayed. Again, how we kind of draw district lines. So we'll see.
Okay, we could probably go on for another half hour. So unfortunately, our time is up. Before I ask you to thank our guests, let me remind you, if you want to go to the Ann Garrels lecture tomorrow evening in Spokane, I think we have a few tickets left. You can come see Richard or me after. Joining me now in thanking Dan for reading.